Hi, I'm CJ and this is my RC channel. Here's a little food for thought. This is fairly small in size. The work area is limited to the bounds of the frame and how the, of course, there's also the sliders within the track area. So the actual work area maximum size is smaller than the internal frame. This material is available in various sizes and in various lengths. Conceivably, a larger framework could be built. In other words, these pieces could be bought in larger lengths, and of course, longer belt material would be needed, but a larger work area could be created using all of the original parts and just replacing the frame rails themselves and the belts. So cutting larger items is possible. Something I may experiment with down the road. We'll see. The next step is assembling the outer sliders. And that's going to involve these two pieces of acrylic and two of the stepper motors. At this point, I would take all three stepper motors and attach the gears. The output shafts have a flat side, so make sure that one of these Allen locker bolts is in position over one of the flat sections, and then just anchor the other one. Don't tighten them down at this time. You want to leave these just snug because you're going to need to do a fine-tune adjustment on the actual placement of this along the shaft so that there's no binding. So you're going to have to loosen and retighten these again later. So just make sure they're snug enough to stay in place. The next step is going to be anchoring two motors to two of these plates, and you're going to want a left side and a right side. I'm going to go ahead and get started on that and pick up in a moment. Okay, here are the two halves with the motors attached. Couple things I would recommend. Again, and this is going to go for all of the acrylic, and I'm probably going to repeat this more than once. The kit does not provide washers. These bolts are very small heads compared to the holes they pass through. Over tightening these could easily crack this material. Snug them down, make sure they're tight, but be very cautious not to over tighten. It's very likely that this could be split. Down the road, I may actually buy slightly longer hardware and buy washers and rebuild this. If this proves to be a nice, reliable item, I may upgrade it in a variety of ways. So as I mentioned before, you want a left side and a right side. And another thing, these items are going to track back and forth along the frame. And this is totally up to you because there's no recommendation in the instructions or the build videos. I am putting the motors with the outputs facing to the side, and I've made both of them so they point to the same side because the computer, or the whatever you want to call it, the drive board, is going to attach to the side of the frame. And there are going to be a pair of connector cables that are going to attach to these two motors. And so I want the cables not to get hung up in process. And so I am pointing them in the direction that they are going to point to the board. It's, up to you which side you mount the board, so you might face them the other way, whatever. Those wires and the wires for the top gantry, there is no immediate solution or described solution on how to route those so they don't become a problem. You don't want them getting into the work area and moving things. I've considered a couple of ideas. I think the best solution that I can think up so far is to create something along the lines of a whip antenna. Take a piece of spring wire, like music wire, and anchor it somewhere on the frame, bend it into a little bit of a curve, and then attach a tether to the midsection of the cable so that it holds, oh, that's great, so that it holds the cables up and allows them to extend and contract with the mechanism as things move around. I'll demonstrate that down the road as I go, because I think that's probably the best way to do it. To try not to have to do things like that, pointing the wires in the correct direction, like the direction of the control box, versus pointing them up or pointing them down, is probably helpful. So we'll see. I may be wrong about this. I may want to put them up so that the wires, come up and, towards the control board. So we'll see. Okay, the next step is gathering some parts. I like to do things kind of assembly line fashion. So I've gathered both sets over here for both plates. You're going to need 8 of these wheels. You're going to need 8 of these. These are the 35 millimeter M5s. And you're going to need 8 of these little plastic barrel spacers. And just set them up like so. And then you're going to need 8 of these bolts. Now, I wish these were a nylon lock nut versus this type of locking mechanism. The knurling is going to bite into the acrylic and provide locking. Unfortunately, that is far more likely to damage the acrylic than just a standard nylon locking nut. They gave us locking nuts for a few other things, but they didn't give them for something as important as this. For the moment, I'm going to go ahead and assemble with this hardware. Again, this is another item I might replace down the road, would be to replace those bolts with lock nuts and washers. And another thing would be to put a metal washer on the spacer, but that might not be as big a deal. Now, what you want to do is you're going to locate 4 of these in the holes here, and there's 2 holes that are slotted, here and here. Okay, so on the same side as the gear, you're going to place these through here and put on the bolts. I would snug them down at first. The 2 top ones you can go ahead and tighten. Again, don't over tighten, especially with the knurling on those bolts. These 2 leave a little loose because you're going to want to fine tune the tension because the rail is going to slide through here. Okay, and the number one problem I've heard people having seems to stem from binding. So you don't want these things to be loose because this is a precise piece of equipment. You don't want this thing to be able to rock. At the same time, you don't want the wheels to be so tight against the rail that it's stiff and it has to stretch the rubber belts. And those control belts could potentially have a little bit of stretch to them. Any stretching to compensate for binding is going to make for an imprecise product at the end of the line. So bear that in mind. Set the lower ones up loose at first and adjust them when you get to that part of the assembly so that you can have the mechanism move freely without any binding and without any play. Okay, I have both of them assembled. There's no play and they move quite smoothly. Now, you don't expect it to, be super fast on the glide. You just want it to be able to glide like this with a little bit of a turn. These the bearings have a certain stiffness to them because they're packed with heavy grease and they are sealed bearings, so the seals themselves provide a certain amount of drag. You've got 4 of them, you've got the rubber, and the fact that there is a bit of a clamping action here. So to make it play free, it's not going to be super fast, but this is what you're looking for right here. It's just a nice smooth action. So just like that. and that's going to serve you just fine. I highly recommend using good tools. They provide a couple of these little Allen wrenches. I'm not a big fan of cheap stamp tools like this. They tend not to be as accurate in size, and the size of them physically can make them difficult to work with. For example, these are going to need to be adjusted so that they are lined up properly for the belt. As you see, this one needs to come out. Having a wrench that is long enough to reach those grub screws is incredibly helpful. Otherwise, you're going to have to, take this little wrench and make very small adjustments. It's hard to get it as tight as you want, things of that nature. So get yourself some good tools. What you mainly need for this project is a 2mm for the grub screws, 2.5 for the M3s, and a 4mm for the M5s. And then, of course, you'll need a wrench or a small socket set, something along those lines. Anyway, okay, so on to the next step. The next step is probably going to be putting the frame together or starting to work on the gantry itself. Actually, I got ahead of myself a little bit. The next step is going to be to anchor the belt here and here, running it through the gears and getting that in position. The belt is one piece, and this actually is good from a certain point of view, that it's not pre-cut. It shows me that I can buy this belt in large lengths. That would allow me, if I wanted to increase the size of this merely by getting larger pieces of this extruded aluminum stock. So also, when you're starting to get this going, remember to make sure you're using the right size. These are wrapped in some plastic. Give them a bit of a cleanup. One of them had a little bit of, oxidation on it. I had to scrub it a little bit with Brillo pad or a non-scratch kitchen pad, but didn't quite get it completely clean. No big deal. It's just, cosmetic. But remember, there's two of one size and a third one of a different length. The longest one is going to be your gantry. So when you're cutting this material, you want to kind of make sure that you're making 3 pieces, but one of them needs to be longer than the other. Fortunately, I'm just kind of stretching this out here like so. Okay, so if you make it into 3 just evenly, it looks like there's certainly enough, more than enough for the 3. I would cut one longer than the others, though. I wouldn't just make it 3 equal pieces, even though it looks like 3 would be enough to do that little bit of distance you're going to lose here. I'm going to cut one of them a couple inches longer than the others, just to be sure. So basically what I'm going to do is, okay, so we've got a couple inches here. I'm basically going to give myself that extra distance plus an inch or so, and then I'm going to stretch the rest out like this. So that's equal, and that gives me my 3 pieces. So I'll just go ahead and trim this. So there we go. So these are my 2 shorter pieces. Yep. And this is my 1 longer piece. So that's the long one. I can set that one aside, and I need to rig up these 2. And I'm just going to go over this again. I talked about this earlier. This is going to clamp this down. So you need to feed this through the slot here like that. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull one of these off so I can anchor this down. Okay, so, and that isn't quite centered under there. I want to make sure that is directly beneath that bolt. Okay, so that is how it's going to go. And I'm going to put these at the very end. So got the maximum distance of travel. As you can see, the bolt is going to press down on there. And hold this in place so it stays level. And again, I wanted to put that at the very end. And this is another thing, I wouldn't over tighten. This is, metal against metal with rubber in between, whether it's the rubber, the acrylic, these bolts have the potential to destroy this material. If you tighten this down too hard, it's going to punch a hole through this belt and ruin a piece of it. One thing I would do when setting this up, I would leave extra slack at one end. I mean, I'm left a little bit here, but I'm not going to trim this right away. I'm probably just going to bundle it up and anchor it and make sure that this end is not as tight as this one. Make this the heavy anchor. And that way, if this gets damaged, I can just pull through. That's probably going overboard paranoia on this material, though might not be a bad idea to find a vendor for this belt material and get a piece in. You may have noticed I tend to buy spares when I buy a plane. For example, the little foamy planes, I'll tend to buy an extra prop or two. The kind of items that are very inexpensive and break very easily, but can leave you without a functioning model for a week or more while you wait for some product to come back into stock. Also, sometimes things get canceled. For example, if you look at one of my earlier videos, I did a video on a micro table saw, and I love that thing. I mean, I love that little table saw. It was so useful. Unfortunately, I didn't buy spare blades when I bought it, and they have discontinued. This is a Hobby King product. I don't know who they get it from or whether it's produced by them, but I cannot find the blades. It's a large disc saw blade, about 4 inches in diameter, and mine has gotten dull to the point that it doesn't cut well anymore. It tends to bind, and it's extremely frustrating because, like I said, that was such a great tool. I've used it, constantly. I was always trimming stuff with it because I could get a nice 90-degree cut. I could cut, 5 pieces all the same length very quickly. It just was a wonderful item to have around. And unfortunately, I don't use it now because it's gone dull. If I cut with it, it'll, as it's going through a longer piece, it'll bind. I can still cut small stock with it. But, things like that. If I'd been thinking, I would have bought at least 2 spare blades and had them. And I would have gotten a lot more life out of that. Maybe they'll come around and do another production run at some point, and there'll be more blades. I've even thought about buying another one You know, they're not that expensive. They're about $30 a pop, which, you know, depending on your point of view, it's not cheap. The blades themselves were like $8 to $10. So I've almost considered buying another one. That way I'd have a spare motor as well. But, you know, considering that I didn't even get a full year of modeling out of the one blade, you know, I just worry that I'm, you know, feeding a beast that is, you know, going to continue to cost and cost and cost. You know, I'd have been happy buying the blades at $10 a pop. And if I had known at the time I bought it for the $30 or $40 I paid for it, I would have bought 3 or 4 blades. But, you know, sometimes getting spares up front when you purchase something is a good idea. Just food for thought. This is my experience. Hopefully you learn from it, gain something from it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please click like and please subscribe to my channel.